Yesterday, Canadians went to the polls to elect their new government. Despite a slight tightening in the final days of the campaign, and a last-minute truth social from Donald Trump imploring Canadians to become America's 51st state, in the end, the Liberals, now led by former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, won again, which would have been unimaginable only a few months ago. So in this video, we're going to look at the Liberals' astonishing revival, what happened yesterday, and what it means for Canada. So let's start with a quick recap. As you probably already know, the defining story of this campaign has been the revival of Canada's Liberal Party, and the consequent decline of the Conservatives. Only 6 months ago, a Conservative landslide looked pretty much inevitable. Incumbent Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was ridiculously unpopular, with a net approval rating of -52 in December, and the economy was stagnant, with GDP per capita actually falling throughout 2022 and 2023. And the polls had the Conservatives, led by Pierre Poilievre, up by something like 25 points. It seemed pretty much guaranteed that Poilievre would soon succeed Trudeau, and the only real question was about the margin of victory. Today, however, things look completely different. Since January, the Liberals have been steadily surging in the polls, while the Conservatives have been slipping, and most of the last pre-election polls had the Liberals slightly ahead of Conservatives. This reversal had two main drivers. First, and most obviously, Trump. Trump's constant threats of trade wars and annexation have upended Canadian politics, turning an election that had previously been focused on domestic issues like the economy into a referendum on which leader is best suited to handle Trump. Unfortunately for Poilievre here, Canadians generally prefer Trudeau's successor, former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney. The most recent Ipsos polling, for instance, found that 49% of Canadians thought Carney would be best placed to negotiate with Trump, compared to 33% who thought it would be Poilievre. Similarly, while Poilievre's aggressive rhetoric worked against an unpopular incumbent like Trudeau, it started looking inappropriately divisive in the context of Trump's assault on Canadian sovereignty. The second reason is Carney. Not only is Carney way more popular than Trudeau, he's also way more popular than both Poilievre and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. According to Angus Reid, Carney's approval rating has hovered around +15 for most of the campaign, while both Poilievre and Singh have hovered around -20. Anyway, this was obviously bad news in and of itself for Poilievre and the Conservatives, but it's made even worse by the fact that Canada uses a first-past-the-post electoral system, which tends to favour the Liberals. In other words, seats go to whichever candidate wins the most votes in each of Canada's 343 geographical constituencies, which are called ridings in Canada. These sorts of majoritarian systems generally favour larger parties, but in Canada the system especially favours the Liberals over the Conservatives, because Conservative vote share tends to be more concentrated in specific areas, while Liberal votes are more evenly, and therefore more efficiently, distributed. This is especially true at the election, because the Liberal poll surge came at the expense of the NDP, a smaller party to the left of the Liberals, who could have otherwise split the left-wing vote, which would have been great for the Conservatives. Anyway, you can sort of see what we mean if you compare 338 Canada's poll aggregator with its seat forecast. In mid-March, the Conservatives were still 3 points ahead of the Liberals, but 338 Canada was already predicting that the Liberals would win more seats, because their vote share is more evenly distributed. And you can sort of see this in the actual results, which started coming out earlier this morning. While the Liberals did beat the Conservatives in the popular vote, they slightly underperformed the polls and only beat them by about 1.5 points, winning 43.1% of the vote to the Conservatives' 41.7%. Nonetheless, this translated into a pretty sizable seat advantage. With 96% of votes counted, the Liberals are currently projected to win 48.1%, or 166 of the 343 seats available, and the Conservatives on track to win 42.9%, or 146. As usual, the Liberals performed best in urban areas, including Toronto, Montreal and Vancouver, while the Conservatives performed best in more rural areas in the southwest, especially in the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. The remaining seats will mostly go to the Bloc Québécois, a Quebec nationalist party that only runs candidates in the province of Quebec, and the New Democratic Party, a social democratic party that sits to the left of the Liberals. This was actually an okay result for the Bloc Québécois, who slightly outperformed the polls and won a projected 23 seats. This is admittedly well down on the 32 they won at the last election, with most of these seats going to the Liberals, but it's still better than some of the more pessimistic pre-election polls. Conversely, it was a pretty terrible result for the NDP, who've been falling steadily in the polls ever since Carney took charge of the Liberals. Unfortunately for the NDP, they ended up slightly underperforming the polls, winning just 6.1% of the popular vote and just 7 seats. This is a pretty terrible result compared to the last election in 2021, when they won nearly 18% of the vote and 25 seats, and their leader, Jagmeet Singh, has already resigned. So, what does all this mean for Canada? Well, as you've probably already noticed, the Liberals look like they've fallen short of the 172 seats required to form an outright majority government. This means Carney will face almost the same predicament as Trudeau did in 2021, namely whether to go into some sort of electoral alliance with the NDP, which would just about give him enough seats for a majority. Trudeau ended up negotiating a confidence and supply agreement with the NDP, which worked pretty well and survived for nearly 3 years until the NDP withdrew in September of last year. However, this might be slightly harder for Carney, given he's probably slightly to the right of Trudeau, while the NDP are well off to the left of the Liberals, although much here depends on who the NDP elect as their new leader. Ultimately, while Mark Carney is clearly a popular and savvy politician, he really has Donald Trump to thank for this remarkable electoral turnaround. Without Trump's threats of annexation and trade wars, this Liberal comeback would have been unimaginable. And it'll be interesting to see if Trump has a similar, but probably less acute effect on this weekend's Australian election, where it looks like a right-wing challenger to an incumbent left-wing government is struggling to shake associations with Trump.